Hello, everybody. My name is Dr. Yaffa, and I'm approaching the shooting of this video really with awe as I dare to question the scientific consensus and the almost sacred notion that the mRNA vaccines provide protection against severe illness and death by COVID. You probably remember how at the beginning of the vaccination campaign, the medical narrative, it focused on the vaccine's efficacy against infections, not against severe illness. That was the whole justification for the vaccine passports. This is how Dr. Fauci referred to the vaccines in May 2021. When you get vaccinated, this is Fauci's words, not mine. When you get vaccinated, you not only protect your own health, but also you contribute to the community health by preventing the spread of the virus. You become a dead end to the virus. But then something happened. The medical narrative had changed. Suddenly, the justification to keep administering the booster doses of the vaccines started to revolve around their presumed efficacy against severe illness and deaths. This is how Albert Bourla referred to the first booster in January 2022. The 3 doses with a booster, this is his words, the 3 doses with a booster, they offer reasonable protection against hospitalizations and deaths, and less protection against infection. So today, if you ask laypersons about the usefulness of the vaccines, or even physicians, they will probably echo this narrative and tell you, yes, the vaccines are not really effective against infections, but of course, they prevent severe illness and death. But is this really true? Does the existing scientific literature really support the notion that the 2 types of protection are independent from each other, that the protection against severe illness and death remained high while the protection against infections disappeared? In our new article at the Journal of American Physicians and Surgeons, Dr. Yaffa Shir-Raz, Dr. Shay Zakov, Dr. Peter McCullough, and myself, we all aim to answer these questions from a pure scientific point of view. We conducted a rigorous review of representative data from 3 types of sources: the original clinical trials by Pfizer and Moderna, the more contemporary studies on the 4th dose of the vaccine, and the popular dashboards of pandemic statistics. In this relatively short video, I will not be able to present our entire findings. As you can imagine, the efficacy devil is in the little scientific details. So I really urge you to read our article and judge the evidence for yourself. However, I do wish to give you a taste of our findings using 3 examples, starting with the founding clinical trial by Pfizer. One might falsely assume that the key questions I presented at the beginning of this video were already answered in the phase 3 randomized control trial by Pfizer, the one that allowed the FDA to issue its emergency authorization to use the COVID vaccines. After all, randomized controlled trials are considered to be the gold standard in biomedical research. Nevertheless, this key clinical trial did not really teach us anything about the ability of the vaccines to protect against severe illness and death. Specifically for the last, Pfizer reported that 6 months after the injections, there were no significant differences in the number of deaths from all causes between the group that received the vaccines and the control group that received the placebo. And you know what? During the open label stage of their study, when the blind condition was terminated and the participants receiving the placebo could have chosen to be given the real vaccine, Pfizer evidenced 5 additional death cases, and they all occurred among people who took the vaccine. In other words, in this key clinical trial, science did not support the idea that the vaccines protect against deaths. In fact, some might argue that science provided an important warning about these vaccines. Okay, so if formal clinical trials cannot be relied on, perhaps we can turn to the less strong research designs that investigated the vaccines in real-life settings through the observational and not experimental measures. Of course, the observational studies should be carefully interpreted because they are vulnerable to real-life biases. A highly known example for such a bias is the problem of uneven testing levels, in which, in real life, unvaccinated people were forced to test for COVID-19, while vaccinated people were exempted from these tests. Nevertheless, despite the inherent biases of such studies, we decided to review all the observational studies that were conducted on the efficacy of the fourth dose and that were published at about the time the FDA authorized this second booster. You will not be surprised that these studies emerged from Israel, the world's lab, as termed by Pfizer officials. Israel was the first country to approve the administration of this second booster, even before the FDA's official authorization. And Israel was the first to examine the efficacy of this booster in real-life settings. The first Israeli study I wish to bring here is mentioned in the FDA's news release that reported of their authorization to start using the fourth dose of the vaccine. In this news release, the FDA stated, without a blink of an eye, that the fourth dose improves protection against severe COVID-19. How do they know in the FDA? Well, the only scientific reference they brought to support this straightforward claim was an Israeli study by Sheba Medical Center that, are you ready for it? An Israeli study that did not yield good efficacy results at all. This study did not even address severe illness. But most importantly, the authors of this study, a study that was published in the highly regarded New England Journal of Medicine, the authors themselves concluded that their findings suggest that the second booster may have only marginal benefits. This is their words, not mine. So what could be the evidence behind this FDA's straightforward statement about the efficacy against severe illness? The news release, as mentioned before, does not bring additional efficacy studies to rely on. But we found another Israeli study from the New England Journal of Medicine, a study that was published a week after the FDA's authorization of the fourth dose. In this large study, the authors reported that the fourth dose remained effective against severe illness 6 weeks from its administration, while its efficacy against infections started to drop in about the 5th week, to the point that by the 8th week, the efficacy against infections disappeared completely. To my knowledge, this was the first time that researchers reported results from which readers may deduce that the efficacy of the fourth dose against severe illness is above and beyond its efficacy against infections. To explain this last statement and to evaluate its validity, I need to take a scientific step backward and to talk about a fundamental research concept that is called conditional probability. This will take only 1 minute, and it's really, really important. So theoretically speaking, when studies find indications that a given vaccine is effective against infections, they also typically obtain reduced numbers of severe illness cases in their treatment groups compared with their control groups. Consider, for example, a research scenario whereby 10 participants from the vaccine group were infected by the virus, compared with 100 participants from the control group. These numbers can be interpreted as a good sign for high efficacy against infections. However, what if 1 out of the 10 infected participants from the vaccine group developed severe illness, compared with 10 out of the 100 participants from the control group? In this scenario, the difference in raw numbers, 1 versus 10 severe illness cases, it may sound a lot, but the truth is that these numbers are simply a byproduct of the vaccine's efficacy against infections, as both groups in this hypothetical study had 10% severe illness cases among the participants who got infected. But what will happen in cases in which the vaccine fails to protect against infections, like the situation we face today? Will the protection against severe illness remain? The only way to prove that the vaccines protect against severe illness beyond their efficacy against infections is to show that the conditional probability of severe illness in the vaccine group, that is the percentage of severe illness among those participants who were infected, that this conditional probability is significantly lower than the conditional probability of severe illness among infected participants in the control group. Now that we understand this crucial concept of conditional probability, let's dive into the details of this key Israeli study from the New England. The first thing we need to know about this study is that, for some reason, the monitoring period, the follow-up of severe illness, lasted up until the 6th week from vaccination, while the follow-up period of infections was 2 weeks longer, up until the 8th week. This means that the major finding of this study I presented earlier is limited to an exceptionally narrow time window, starting from the 5th week when the efficacy against infections started to drop, and ending at the 6th week when the monitoring of severe illness stopped. But more importantly, even if we disregard this really strong limitation, when we examine the data that were provided in the article, we discovered something unbelievable. We discovered that the conditional probability of severe illness did not really differ between the treatment and the control groups of this study. About 1% from the infected participants in both groups developed severe illness. Clearly, such results cannot be used to disprove the reasonable and straightforward assumption that the reduction in the vaccine efficacy against infections from the 5th week onward was followed by an equivalent reduction in the vaccine's efficacy against severe illness and deaths, even if this reduction happened 2 weeks later, which is the average time that takes for the severe illness to develop from the first symptoms of the virus. Unfortunately, severe illness 2 weeks later, which is essentially in the 7th week, was not monitored in the study. Not to mention the 10th week, which is really the most interesting time, as it reflects the period when the vaccines do not provide any protection against infections. In conclusion, in this video, I brought 3 examples that challenge the seemingly consensual notion as if the boosted doses are capable of providing long-term protection against severe illness and death. The 3 examples are, of course, only a small part of our article, and I urge you once again not to rely on this video and to review the entire evidence we bring in the full-length article. Please note that I'm not arguing that our article can substitute for a comprehensive, systematic review of all the available evidence. However, in scientific discourse, a single black swan, as termed by Karl Popper, a single negative instance that does not fit in with a theory, may falsify a universal claim. And I promise you that our article portrays numerous such black swans. The widely accepted medical narrative today, as if the boosted doses of the vaccines prevent severe illness and deaths, despite their failure to protect against infections, this narrative, to our understanding, lacks scientific support. We therefore call for an impartial inquiry of the decision-making processes and the global health policies that were implemented during the COVID crisis, especially considering what we know today about the negative implications of these policies and the numerous risks of the vaccines. Thank you very much for watching, and thank you, Yaffa, Shay, and Peter, for daring to write this sensitive yet so important article with me. Bye.